Good evening and welcome to the Narkis St Congregation's Bible Study. We continue on in Acts. We will be following Paul in Caesarea again on trial before Festus here in Acts 25. Let's pray to start. Lord, thank you for this time to get together. Thank you for your saints and your followers that give us strength. And we ask that your Holy Spirit will fill us all and that you will teach us and reveal yourself to us. In your name we ask this. Amen. Okay, let's read in Acts 25. 3 days after arriving in the province, Festus went up from Caesarea to Jerusalem, where the chief priest and the Jewish leaders appeared before him and presented the charges against Paul. They requested Festus, as a favor to them, to have Paul transferred to Jerusalem, for they were preparing an ambush to kill him along the way. Festus answered, Paul is being held at Caesarea, and I myself am going there soon. Let some of your leaders come with me, and if the man has done anything wrong, they can press charges against him there. After spending 8 or 10 days with them, Festus went down to Caesarea. The next day he convened the court and ordered that Paul be brought before him. When Paul came in, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood around him. They brought many serious charges against him, but they could not prove them. Then Paul made his defense. I have done nothing wrong against the Jewish law or against the temple or against Caesar. Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor, said to Paul, Are you willing to go up to Jerusalem and stand trial before me there on these charges? Paul answered, I am now standing before Caesar's court, where I ought to be tried. I have not done any wrong to the Jews, as you yourself know very well. If, however, I am guilty of doing anything deserving death, I do not refuse to die. But if the charges brought against me by these Jews are not true, no one has the right to hand me over to them. I appeal to Caesar. After Festus had conferred with his council, he declared, You have appealed to Caesar. To Caesar you will go. A few days later, King Agrippa and Bernice arrived at Caesarea to pay their respects to Festus. Since they were spending many days there, Festus discussed Paul's case with the king. He said, There is a man here whom Felix left as a prisoner. When I went to Jerusalem, the chief priests and the elders of the Jews brought charges against him and asked that he be condemned. I told them that it is not the Roman custom to hand over anyone before they have faced their accusers and have had an opportunity to defend themselves against the charges. When they came here with me, I did not delay the case, but convened the court the next day and ordered the man to be brought in. When his accusers got up to speak, they did not charge him with any of the crimes I had expected. Instead, they had some points of dispute with him about their own religion and about a dead man named Jesus, who Paul claimed was alive. I was at a loss how to investigate such matters, so I asked if he would be willing to go to Jerusalem and stand trial there on these charges. But when Paul made his appeal to be held over for the emperor's decision, I ordered him held until I could send him to Caesar. Then Agrippa said to Festus, I would like to hear this man myself. He replied, Tomorrow you will hear him. The next day Agrippa and Bernice came with great pomp and entered the audience room with the high-ranking military officers and the prominent men of the city. At the command of Festus, Paul was brought in. Festus said, King Agrippa, and all who are present with us, you see this man. The whole Jewish community has petitioned me about him in Jerusalem and here in Caesarea, shouting that he ought not to live any longer. I found he had done nothing deserving of death, but because he made his appeal to the emperor, I decided to send him to Rome. But I have nothing definite to write to his majesty about him. Therefore, I have brought him before all of you, and especially before you, King Agrippa, so that as a result of this investigation, I may have something to write. For I think it is unreasonable to send a prisoner onto Rome without specifying the charges against him. Just a little review of the context where we are tonight. We've been going on for a few Bible studies where Paul has had returned to Jerusalem from his last trip out to the west. He'd come back to Jerusalem around 57 AD. It was around Shavuot, Feast of Weeks. Come to Jerusalem to celebrate, to make pilgrimage. And he gets attacked when he's at the Temple Mount. Paul gets arrested, taken into custody by the Romans after he's attacked by people on the Temple Mount, and he is brought to Caesarea on the Mediterranean Sea, where Antonius Felix is the Roman governor at that time. And the high priest, who was the one who interviewed him when he was attacked in Jerusalem, was Annas Barnabas. And so we'll remember from last Bible study, Paul stays in Caesarea, imprisoned in the palace of the Roman governor for 2 years. And during this time, the high priest's position will change, and Ishmael, son of Phabi, will take over. And from last Bible study in Acts 25, we learned that Felix, the Roman governor or procurator, he will leave and be fired, deposed, and sent back to Rome. And now this Festus, Porcius Festus, becomes the new Roman governor of Judea, and he sits in Caesarea. That's the capital of Judea at that time. So Ishmael, which son of Phabi, most of what we know about him, which is very little, is from the Jewish historian Josephus, and he's part of the chief priests that we know about in the New Testament. This kind of idiom of these high priestly clans that rule in Jerusalem, and he was appointed by Herod Agrippa II, and then later is going to be deposed by him as well. And his tenure as high priest is not going to be very different from Felix and Festus. Sorry, not Felix and Festus, from Annas and all the other high priests. Felix and Festus are the Roman governors, but his tenure is just going to be full of social and political problems, division in society between the rich and the poor, between the ones in power and the common people. And the ones in power, Josephus talks about them being from these priestly families. And so there will be revolutionary groups going around, Jewish revolutionary groups like the Zealots, who are fomenting rebellion against the Roman authorities, who the Romans are in cahoots. They're in bed together with the high priest and their families. And so there's corruption going on in the temple, abuse of power, and like I said, economic disparity between the rich and the poor. And so only 4 years after Ishmael is high priest, there's going to be a Jewish rebellion against the Roman authority. And this ultimately is going to lead to the destruction of Jerusalem and its temple. So Festus is the new Roman governor in town. And so when he comes over from Rome, he's going to land at Caesarea, and he's going to travel up to Jerusalem, where he's going to meet with the chief priest, this idiom for these priestly clans, and the Jewish leaders. And they're talking to him about wanting to press charges against Paul. But Paul's not in Jerusalem. Paul is in Caesarea. So this is from the model from the Holy Land, which is now in the Israel Museum. And it just wanted to show you where Festus and all the Roman governors would have stayed in Jerusalem, would be in the palace that Herod the Great built down there at the bottom. So the Roman governor's palace from Herod the Great. So originally that was the Herodian palace. Then after Herod's time, starting with Pontius Pilate and the Roman governors, they're going to reside in this long rectangular shaped area by it's near the Jaffa Gate today. And if you go into the renovations that have been done at David's Citadel, there at Jaffa Gate, they've been doing some digging down there and they've revealed some of the lower levels down into that palace area. Quite interesting. Temple Mount's up there to the on the top left. This is a closer view of that palace from this reconstruction. This would be right around the time that Festus would have gone there and had this meeting. And you also remember when Jesus was on trial, brought to Pilate, it's it's thought that he would have also been brought to this palace when he is being accused. And just like the leaders would like to bring Paul here now and accuse him. So Pilate, when he was the Roman governor, would have also been in this palace and seen Jesus here at the western side of the old city by Jaffa Gate. The chief priests, the Jewish leaders, asking Festus if they can charge Paul. And the reason why they're doing it is because they want to ambush and kill him along the way. They want to kill Paul. They don't really want to give him a fair trial, according to Acts 25. And this fits into the time of that period where there's a lot of unrest, there's a lot of lawlessness, there's a lot of murder and attacks going on along the way where road bandits are attacking people or anyone they consider enemies to their cause. So the Zealots and the Sicarii are the most two well-known names at this time for this lawlessness. They're even called brigands by Josephus, and even the Roman governors, depending on how corrupt they were, would hire these guys to to attack their enemies. Like according to Josephus, Felix, the former Roman governor that we read about in Acts 25, he had hired these brigands to murder the high priest at that time. This is just before Paul was there. And so these guys were fomenters of a lot of this stuff going on. And this was from Josephus's Antiquities about Felix, the Roman governor, who was the governor before Festus, hiring these thugs to kill Jonathan, this former high priest. Um, so they're going, and this also reminds us back in Acts 23 when Paul was being transferred to Caesarea, there had been a conspiracy of 40 guys who were going to kill him. And they told the Sanhedrin, so that would be the chief priest and their lot, that you call Paul in, and then we are going to kill him on the way to the meeting with the Sanhedrin. And so this is when Paul gets taken away to Caesarea in the middle of the night to avoid this conspiracy in Acts 23. So they're still up to the same plan here. And Festus, he's in Jerusalem, he's meeting with them, and he says, well, Paul's in Caesarea. I'm going to go to Caesarea. Why don't you send some of your leaders to Caesarea and we will talk about the charges there. So again, back in Caesarea, this is the palace of Herod that he built, which is now the Roman governor's palace in Caesarea. And Paul is being held down underground there in that red circle area at the entrance of the palace. And this is what it looks like today. And a lot of that front part of the palace on the water has been washed out, but there's some remains there. And so Festus spends 8 or 10 days in Jerusalem, and then he goes finally down to Caesarea. He holds his court, brings Paul on. And so, again, his accusers come in, bringing the charges, and then Paul makes his defense. I've done nothing wrong against the Jewish law or against the temple or against Caesar. Here's a famous painting of Paul before Festus. He's there on the left, and the toga on the stage, the bema, and there would be Agrippa the second and Bernice, which we will get to in a second. What do we learn about Festus here? Wishing to do the Jews a favor, said to Paul, "Are you willing to go up to Jerusalem to face your charges?" And you remember the conspirators were trying to get Festus to let him travel back to Jerusalem when the guard would be light, where they could assassinate him. So it seems like Festus is a little corrupt here. He's, um, well, looking to get, I guess, Paul killed along the way, if he knows about it. And we don't know a lot about Festus or his character. The very little that we do know about him from Josephus is he is better than the previous Roman governor, Felix. So that was Josephus's assessment of Festus, and Festus ends up dying as governor. So his term is quite short, and that's really all we know about him. And so Paul answers Festus and is saying, I I'm here to be tried, but I've done nothing wrong to my people, the Jews, and and all the charges that are being brought against me are not true. And if we think back to the charges, he was causing a disturbance on the Temple Mount. This was one of the false charges. Another was he was bringing Greeks onto the Temple Mount, onto the temple where they shouldn't be. And according to Acts, all of this was false. And so these are the charges that are being brought, and there's no evidence in this trial. And so Paul makes this fateful statement, I appeal to Caesar. And then Festus talks to his council, and he's saying, to Caesar you will go. So what is this all about? I appeal to Caesar you will go. We know how Paul is a Roman citizen. We know that from back in Acts 21 when he told the Roman officer who had arrested him, I have Roman citizenship. And back then it was a big deal to have that citizenship because you were given certain rights and protections under the Roman law. Um, you couldn't be tortured or crucified, except like in cases of treason. So not not like what the Romans were doing to the Jewish people. A Roman citizen could not be treated like that. They had due process as citizen. They could vote, hold office. They could make contracts. They could serve in the Roman army in a special category. And for our study tonight, number 7, you had a right to a fair trial. And so if you felt that in your situation things were biased against you, you could appeal to Rome or the emperor. And so that local provincial official who was working for the Roman government had to send you to Rome for the final say on your case. And so this is what Paul has done. And this was a law that apparently had been around a little bit before the time of Jesus, um, called Lex de Publica, and it forbade any magistrate, any judge to kill, scourge, chain, torture, or even sentence a Roman citizen who had announced his intention to appeal, and they could not prevent him going to Rome to lodge his appeal. So this is what Paul had done, and apparently this is the only example. This, when you say I appeal to Caesar, it's called the provocatio. This is the only example that you have of a ancient court transcript where it occurred. Um, it's talked about in other ancient writings, this privilege, but this, as far as an actual court case, this is the only court case that is written down where it's used. So a few days later, Paul's appealed to Caesar, so Festus is still holding him, but King Agrippa and Bernice arrive at Caesarea to pay their respects to Festus. And so they're spending some time together, and Festus starts telling him about Paul. And so King Herod Agrippa the second, who is this person that we know very little about, typically from a church background. Um, he is the great grandson of Herod the Great, and in particular, he's the son of Herod Agrippa the first, which we'll remember from Acts 12, where we remember the story that Agrippa the first arrested some of the followers of Jesus from the church and was trying to persecute them. And in particular, he had James, the brother of John, so one of the original 12 disciples, beheaded. And then he arrested Peter as well. And he was planning to also cut his head off as well over Passover or after Passover. And so that was the father of this King Herod that we're reading about now with Festus. And here's the family tree. This is part of the family tree of Herod the Great, and it's actually much bigger than this as far as his wives and children. But this is an important subset of those descendants. So tonight we're looking at Herod Agrippa II, the one at the bottom in the orange circle, and his father is above him, Herod Agrippa I, the one who chopped off the head of James. Agrippa's family, Agrippa I, is a descendant from the Hasmonean dynasty, the Maccabees, the ones that were priests that ended up taking over the kingship of Israel before the time of the Romans. And so he's a son of Aristobulus. So you see, Aristobulus is up there. And Aristobulus was the son of Herod the Great. He was one of the many sons of Herod the Great. And what's significant about him is he was born from Miriam, which was the favorite wife of Herod the Great. She was Hasmonean. She was descended from the Hasmoneans, the Maccabees. And so these are this priestly family from the Hasmonean dynasty. So Miriam has Aristobulus. Aristobulus has Herod Agrippa the first, and then Herod Agrippa the first has our Herod Agrippa the second in tonight's Bible study. So Herod Agrippa the second is the great grandson of Herod the Great, and his father. So now we're talking again about Agrippa the first from Acts 12. His father Aristobulus was killed by Herod the Great we all remember that Herod the Great was quite paranoid and he killed multiple family members over time. And so he had his son Aristobulus killed when he was in his teens. And he also had his brother Alexander killed as well. Actually, they were both killed at the same time. Before that, he had killed their mother, Miriam. Ironically, she was his favorite wife, and yet he was jealous of her and let's just call him crazy, mentally disabled or unstable. And not only does he kill all of them in the Hasmonean dynasty, there's Miriam has a brother, Aristobulus III. She has a mother, Alexandra, and her grandfather, Hyrcanus II, who was a former high priest. Herod the Great had all of them killed as well. So he's a slaughtering machine, a paranoia machine. And this is the line that Herod Agrippa is coming from. He's got to be paranoid himself just because of what his grandfather had done. But this is the life of Herod Agrippa the first. And so not the one we're talking about tonight. This is his father. He's sent to Rome at the age of 6, and he is raised in the upper class of Roman society, which his father and his uncle, Aristobulus and Alexander, the ones who were killed when they were teenagers, they all kind of follow this. It's kind of like going off to boarding school for the rich and famous. They go to Rome, and so they're raised in this pagan Roman society of the rich and famous. And so you go to school with all of the up and coming future emperors. And so Herod Agrippa becomes friend with Caligula, and Caligula will become emperor at some point. And because of that friendship, Agrippa will climb in power back in his homeland. And so Caligula, who becomes emperor, gives Agrippa territory to rule over. So this is the first section that Agrippa the first is given up there and on the eastern side of the Jordan and eastern side of the Sea of Galilee. Herod Antipas, it's the uncle of Agrippa, is trying to take more power, and Caligula is younger than Antipas because Caligula is a peer with Agrippa because, right, they grew up together in Rome. And so he decides to depose Antipas, Herod Antipas. Remember, Herod Antipas is the one who's there at the trial of Jesus. He's the one who has the head of John the Baptist cut off. Herod Antipas is sent into exile to Spain, and then Caligula gives his territory to Agrippa. So now Agrippa the first, his power, his area expands over into the Galilee where Antipas had ruled, and then down into Perea, kind of on the side of Jordan today. And then Caligula is murdered because Caligula is a nutcase, and he's replaced by Claudius. Unfortunately for Agrippa, he also was friends with Claudius. And so Claudius continues to bestow upon Agrippa favor, and he ends up giving Agrippa the first rule over Judea and Samaria and Idumea. And so Agrippa, for 3 years, has pretty much the same area of control that Herod the Great, his grandfather, had. But as we know from Acts 12, Agrippa the first doesn't live very long because, according to Acts 12 and Josephus, he's struck down by God in Caesarea for not giving God the glory and the praise. And so he ends up getting struck down and dying a slow and painful death. And so you would think that would be a reason to see him cursed by God. And this is obviously the opinion from the New Testament. And it seems like Josephus is also in that camp. But if you read other Jewish literature from that time and or shortly after from the Mishnah, Agrippa is remembered not as a bad king, but actually as a pious king, a religious king, a king who was faithful to his Jewish background, his Jewish tradition. And so he was remembered as participating in the feast and reading from the Torah and all of that. And also, he's remembered for defending Jewish interest when he was in the Roman Empire, when he would go to Rome, and because he knew these crazy emperors, he had the ability to speak to them and they would listen. And so the Jewish people were not suffering as much at this time. And um, and so he even the people were praying for him when he got sick at the end, where Acts talks about the worms, um, all of that eating him. There were people praying for him, according to Josephus, there at the bottom. And when he dies in 44, his son, his heir, Agrippa II, was around 17 years old, and he was considered too young or too immature to rule. And so the Emperor Claudius takes back all of his father's territories and puts it under the Roman governors. So there, Agrippa I dies. There's that X marking him dead. And then his son is in the red on the right, Agrippa II. And there in the purple, right in the middle of the map, is the Roman presence ruling all of this area. This is the background now for our Herod Agrippa II in tonight's Bible study. Because, like his father and like his grandfather, he was also sent off to Rome as a child to be educated. And he grew up in the court of Emperor Claudius. And before this, you'll recall his father had died, or his father died when he was around 17. And so during his time in Rome, he built a strong political network. And he also had the ability, like his father, to speak in to Jewish interest in the Roman court. And so after some time, after his father dies, now he's in his 20s, Emperor Claudius appoints him to be king of a little area called Chalcis, which is in Lebanon, near Baalbek. And he succeeds his uncle Herod of Chalcis. But besides this, he's also given authority over the Jerusalem temple to appoint and remove high priests, which is what he will do for the rest of the years that the temple exists. It's another 20 years, but he has that um, privilege under Roman authority. A few years after this, the Emperor Claudius, I guess, looks upon Agrippa II, sees he's done a good job in Chalcis, and he starts to give him more authority, more lands of being in charge of. And so Iturea, Trachonitis, Batanea, Gaulanitis, Aranitis, and Paneas. And so Agrippa II, is going to move down to Caesarea Philippi, Banyas. If you've ever been on a tour of Israel, every group goes to Banyas, where Pan was worshipped and where most tour guides have Jesus in front of that area where he's telling Peter, on this rock I will build my church, in contradistinction to the pagan rock over there, but referring to this new thing that God's doing for the Jewish people. And so Jesus was in the area of Caesarea Philippi, when he has this famous discussion with Peter and the disciples about the rock and the keys to the kingdom. But many years later now, Agrippa II goes and refurbishes Caesarea Philippi and makes it his primary residence and seat of power, and it becomes the administrative capital in this region. And um, and then a couple years later, after Nero becomes emperor and Claudius dies, he's given some more cities and villages, like Tiberias, for example, that come under Agrippa II's rule. But out of all of these areas, they're not predominantly Jewish. They're mainly Gentile because he's never has power or control in Jerusalem. He gets to speak into the temple a bit with the high priest, but he has no real authority in Jerusalem. So he doesn't have the same clout as his father, Agrippa the First, did. When he ruled, he was the governor, the king of Jerusalem, of Judea, and Agrippa the Second is not. So if you've been to Caesarea Philippi, Banyas, this is the remains of the palace that are believed that Agrippa II built, and just some artistic renderings about what that area could have looked like at that time, especially with that gate down there at the bottom. This is the area that Agrippa II is ruling. The Romans are controlling Judea, Samaria, all of the mainland, but Agrippa II has a little kingdom up there in that red square, and that green star is his capital that he's dwelling in Caesarea Philippi. And as far as his legacy, his character, he doesn't have the same legacy as his father, because he appoints and deposes the high priest in Jerusalem quite politically, capriciously. So that's not liked because you see the corruption playing out. He's very pro-Roman, like, well, like his father was, and and so he prints coins honoring the Roman emperors, and he keeps these strong relationships over time that we've seen with Claudius and Nero, and then eventually Vespasian and Titus. So, in the 17th year of his reign, Agrippa II, the Jewish rebellion is fomenting, and so people are at their wits' end in Jerusalem, and they are violence is happening, and Agrippa II does this famous speech. Josephus has it, where he tries to talk sense into the people, and it's quite a pragmatic speech because he's laying out the reality of, do you really want to go against the whole Roman Empire, who are loaded to the gills, and they start to listen to him, and they're trying to get um, the from Josephus's rendering of the speech, there's a bit of a back and forth, and but eventually, when Agrippa II says, just we need to pay our taxes to Rome, we need to keep supporting the machine, that's kind of when the people flip and they start throwing stones at him. And so he and his sister Berenice flee Jerusalem. The rebellion, the war starts, and Agrippa II sides completely with the Romans. He brings troops, adds to the Roman armies that come to fight there under the generals Vespasian and his son Titus. And apparently he is even close enough to the battle that he gets wounded at the siege of Gamla. And then later on, when Titus becomes the general in charge, Agrippa II is a part or around his campaign, and he's even in Jerusalem when it's destroyed and in its aftermath. When Josephus writes his histories, his Antiquities of the Jews and the wars, which will come some years after all of this, all these battles that happen. Agrippa II is one of the first-hand witnesses that he interviews for his writings, and Josephus even preserves two of Agrippa's letters for his research purposes. And apparently, Agrippa II dies without a wife. He dies childless, and he lives another 20 to 30 years. And with him dies the Herodian dynasty that had started with Herod the Great. So he's the last Herodian ruler in this area. And so when he comes to visit Festus, he brings his sister Bernice along with him. And she's a very important person tonight, even though she's only mentioned once or twice. We talked the last Bible study about her sister Drusilla. Drusilla had married Felix, the Roman governor, the former Roman governor of Judea, who had been in Caesarea. And now Bernice, the other sister, they had another sister, Miriam, as well. But Bernice apparently is very close to Agrippa the second because she's often with him, not just in Acts, but other historians, ancient historians, will talk about their close relationship. But I think she has a very tragic um, life, to be honest. She's married off at 13 years old to Marcus Julius Alexander, I believe from the area of Egypt, Alexandria. But he dies a few years later, and then she is sent off to marry her uncle, Herod of Chalcis, that area up there in Lebanon. And she has two sons with him. And then he doesn't live very long, another 4 years or so, he dies. And so now she's had two husbands die, and she ends up staying there in Chalcis, and her brother moves in, Agrippa II, because you'll remember the emperor gave Agrippa II at this time Chalcis as his first place of authority, his first place to rule. And so Bernice lives with her brother Agrippa II there in the upper part of Lebanon and Chalcis. But soon some rumors start to pick up, and Josephus kind of alludes to them in his writings that Bernice lived with her brother in such a manner as it raised the suspicions of many, and the world took ill of her. And so what are we talking about here? Well, there are rumors that build up that she is having an incestuous relationship with Agrippa II, and maybe this has to do with him never marrying or having children. Um, and so in this time, she marries another guy, Polemon, king of Cilicia, maybe to kind of cover up or to have an excuse for what's going on. But it's very sketchy, and this marriage to Polemon lasts a very short time, like maybe a year or barely. And so the rumors have been building, and it goes into all the way across the Mediterranean to Rome, and even like famous satirists like Juvenal are writing these plays or these books and talking about this incestuous relationship, even though most scholars say there's no proof for this, that this was all political machinations to try to kind of ruin her reputation. And the reason is coming up. The reason why the Roman people would want to drag her name through mud is because after Bernice and Agrippa have moved to Caesarea Philippi, when he's given that area to be his administrative capital, they're going to then come to Caesarea for the trial for Paul, like we're reading tonight. And then shortly after this trial with Paul, the Jewish Roman war is going to start, and she is going to have an affair with the Roman general Titus. And you'll remember Titus, if you know your history. He's later going to become emperor of Rome. And in Jewish tradition, he's also cursed because, may his name be wiped out because he's the one who destroys Jerusalem and the temple after 70. And so your Bernice is literally sleeping with the devil from the Jewish perspective. And from the Roman perspective, she's this foreign woman who is with the Roman blood and tainting, their ruler, the emperor Titus. And so she's given a terrible reputation in Rome. And so depending on how you read some of these ancient writers, what to believe, what not to believe, she eventually has this bad reputation, but when Titus becomes emperor, she is sent away from Rome, and that is the last we really know about her. She goes back to presumably her brother Agrippa II, and they lived to close to the end of the century, perhaps, and probably in Caesarea Philippi, um, and under the Roman occupation after the destruction of Jerusalem and the war that left brought much havoc. And actually, there's quite a bit of historical evidence for her existence besides all of these Roman authors and Josephus and even Acts 26 talking about her with these inscriptions that have been found in Beirut, Athens, Delos, talking about Bernice as a queen even. So she she was always has this title as queen, even though they're the kingdom that's left to them, to her and her brother Agrippa II, is really not much more than a Roman occupation. And one last interesting thing, if you ever go up to Tiberias, here's a map here of modern Tiberias in the big orange circle. Before you enter into modern Tiberias, there are the remains of the ancient city of Tiberias, the original Roman city that was built there around the time of Jesus. If you were to climb up to the top of the mountain that hovers over the ancient city, there's a theater and gates and all kinds of bathhouses down there in the ancient city. If you climb up to the top of the hill, there's a mount. It's called Mount Bernice or Berniki, and this is an ancient site that has legend and tradition connected to it. This is looking down at the Sea of Galilee from Mount Bernice. Antipas, right, the uncle of Agrippa, built Tiberias, and he named it after the Roman emperor at that time, Tiberius. And according to Josephus, on top of that city, at the top of the mountain, he built a house that kind of shimmered or glimmered. Some scholars call it the Golden House. It's thought that up there was the remnants of this palace of Tiberius, of Antipas that he built for himself overlooking Tiberias. But so far, at least, unless there's been some new archaeological work, the main thing they've found up there is the excavations of an 8th century church. But what's fascinating is the local tradition, which has been passed down through Arabic tradition, that this is connected to Bernice, this sister of Agrippa II. Perhaps it's because she lived there, and so the memory that's been passed down and legend or folktale has tied her name to this site, which previously would have had this palace that her great uncle would have built. Anyway, let's finish up here tonight with Festus bringing and talking about Paul's case with Agrippa II, and obviously Bernice is there as well. And he's saying, look, there's this Paul guy and Felix, right, who's married to your sister Drusilla. Well, they left and they left Paul here, and Paul's been here 2 years, and now I've got to figure out what to do with him. And the case is complicated because I'm hearing things that don't quite line up. And so Festus is talking about Felix, and we mentioned before, and just to remind ourselves, Felix is married to Drusilla, the sister of Agrippa II and Bernice, and they both left when Felix was recalled back to Rome because he was a bad governor. He was a corrupt governor. So that's why he got called back. And that's also why he never dealt with Paul because he wanted to use Paul to his advantage. And I guess he ran out of time to figure out how he could make some sort of advantage to himself politically. And so he got called back, and Paul was still there in that jail cell in Caesarea. And so that's the situation. And so Festus kind of goes back over the whole case with Agrippa II that we read earlier. And Paul is talking about this dead man, Jesus, who he claims is alive. It says, I was at a loss how to investigate such matters about Paul and Jesus. So I asked if Paul, would be willing to go to Jerusalem and stand trial there. And then Paul said, no, I want to go see Caesar. And then Agrippa said to Festus, I would like to hear this man myself. And so tomorrow you will hear him. And so Agrippa the second is interested in hearing Paul. And so the next day, Agrippa and Bernice come in to the palace there, the Roman governor's palace in Caesarea, and they bring Paul before him. And Festus gives this introduction to King Agrippa, Agrippa the second. Here is Paul, and people are accusing him. They have all of this bad stuff to say about him, and they're bringing Paul out to Agrippa and Bernice. But Festus says, I've found nothing that is deserving of death, so I'm going to send him to Rome because he's appealed to Caesar. But before I send him to Caesar, King Agrippa, I want to write up an investigation. I want to do more of an interrogation, and I want to be able to explain to Caesar what this case is all about if before I send Paul to Rome. And so that's kind of where I want to leave it tonight. If we take this from the perspective of Luke, who's writing the book of Acts, he's writing the book of Luke Acts. How does he begin his writing? Where he says, I've taken up this account, this event, to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught. So Luke, he wasn't there when Jesus rose from the dead. He wasn't there among the 12 disciples. Luke comes at this from hearing the stories, interviewing the eyewitnesses, and he's writing his gospel and the Acts down as well as an investigation. And so I kind of see tonight where Luke is portraying this trial, this trial that's going to play out now before Festus. And it's not really a trial, right? Because he's already going to be sent off to Caesar, but it's a public hearing from Paul's account of his experience with Jesus. And so this hearing of Paul is really going to be, that's going to be the next Bible study, the next chapter in Acts of Paul's personal testimony about why he's chosen to go through all of this persecution to follow Jesus as the Messiah. And so this is going to be a public account for the Roman rulers, for their government, for something that will go into the wider public awareness, the wider Roman Gentile awareness. And it kind of reminded me of Josephus and what he did as well. You'll remember Josephus was a Jewish historian, and he was around during the Jewish War. And his two most famous works are about that war and also about the Jewish history and the Jewish culture, which really is talking about the Bible, the stories from the Bible. And it's really his defense of the Jewish faith that goes, he publishes it and sends it out to this Greco-Roman world defending this Jewish faith. And so in a way, I see Luke Acts in the same vein, the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles, that Luke is like a Josephus, probably not Jewish, but he's writing to this Gentile audience, to the Greco-Roman world, and trying to explain the stories and the actions of Jesus and his followers and how God is using him not just for this tiny little people group in this small area in the Roman world at that time, but how this is part of God's universal plan for all people's salvation.